Good morning. I want to welcome you to the panel on acquisition reform. We're very fortunate today to have an exceptional speaker, Kevin Miners, as well as a very talented panel to discuss acquisition reform. Just a little bit of background on Kevin. I think he's uniquely qualified in this area. He's worked in all the domains in space with his work on SBIRS and space-based radar. He's worked on air. He's worked on the E3 and practically invented UAVs, as I understand it, when he worked at DARO. He's worked on the ground as the driver behind the DCGS and also worked in air, this work at Nav Air. And so very, very talented. He is the Assistant Director of National Intelligence for Acquisition Technologies and Facilities, highly decorated, and a very nice guy as well. So please join me in welcoming Kevin to the stage.
Thanks. So go ahead. The two things I was going to talk about today was it's more in Bong's area. So Bong gave me the thumbs up that said it's a little more DoD centric in terms of where the department's going with some of their acquisition reform initiatives. But as we all know, DoD is sort of the big horse, and it always flows down to the IC. So I want to start there with the DoD initiatives, where they're at, just in a couple just interesting panels that are going on that you guys should be aware of. And then next, I'll jump into some of the focus areas that we're kind of neck down into more IC focus areas. But as you always know, I got to start with I got a son and a daughter, Zach and Danielle. So it's a small picture, so I'm not sure this is going to work. So Gary, you got to pay attention back there, because I really need you to laugh. So over the years, I've been telling jokes about Zach and Danny. Goofy things they do as they're growing up. Well, they're growing up now. So my son, unfortunately, has inherited my sense of humor. And so he's now telling jokes on me. So I got to tell you the latest Zach joke that he pulled on me. So he starts off the neighborhood party. We're just hanging out, and he tells all the dads as we're standing around. He goes, "Hey, have you ever seen? Go ahead to the next slide. Have you ever seen that weight loss commercial, like the before and after shot?" And so my son, unfortunately, looks a little bit like me. So I'm not tracking his joke at all. And he goes, "Hey, Dad, go ahead and pull up your shirt." And go ahead, next slide. So he basically says, "Look, is this the before and after?" Go ahead, next. So, and Deirdre Walsh basically said that's censored. Nobody should be looking at my gut. So, come on, that wasn't that good? So, we went down to Virginia Tech, and he tried it again. We were down tubing, and the good old boy with the chew in his mouth, he's sitting there, and he goes, "Hey, look at this is before and after me and my dad." And the guy looks, kind of spits his chew out, and he goes, "Boy," he goes, I tell you, you got a six-pack, but your dad's got more like a pony keg." He thought that was pretty funny. All right, so next slide. So one of the first things I wanted you guys to, and you can go online, you type in Section 809 panel, it comes up with a really, really good website. Who here has heard of the Section 809 stuff? Good, excellent. So great website that they have on there, big hitters, Bill LaPlante, all kinds of Deirdre Lee, former govies on this panel. So it's a congressional panel. Again, Deirdre told me to make sure to tell everyone in this audience, I am not endorsing any of their recommendations. I just wanted you guys to be aware of this. Section 809, once you type it in, Google, it'll take you right to the webpage. It's got some really interesting stuff that they're looking at. Again, we think more about process. A lot of the stuff they're looking at is things that we don't typically look at, which is, codifying the FAR and the DFAR, and some of those things that, we just take as gospel. Like, I'd walk down to Susan Gibson's office, and she would say, the FAR and the DFAR say this. So I think what they're doing is they're looking more at the acquisition regulation part of acquisition reform to say, the FAR and DFAR say this, should we change it? So they have open sessions, they have hearings, they have all. So on the website, it gives everyone here an opportunity to weigh in with the Section 809 panel. So that's a congressional panel. I just wanted to give you one of the quotes out of it. Bong has heard me say this now about 4 or 5 times. This is just one of the nuggets out of there. So they had an interim report that came out in May. The final is actually coming out next summer. But anyway, here, go ahead, next slide. It basically says the inescapable conclusion when viewing DoD acquisition as a whole, due to no one's intentions or actions in particular, is that process wins out over results. And again, I tried it within and Bong knows this very well, he from AT&L. We basically said, okay, let's try moving up a milestone B for one of our major system acquisitions. Just let's move it up, 1 month. It was an explosion within LX2. It was crazy. Oh my God, we have all these things we need to do. And you take, because the process says you have to have this, you have to have this, you have to have this. So, as we sat down, Kelly, Gaffney, and I, and Bong, and looked at our folks, we said, so what is it in the next 30 days? What new information are we going to get that's going to affect our decision differently? There was nothing really there. So again, I love this. And there's a whole bunch of quotes like this within their interim report. So anyway, I'd recommend you guys take a look at it. The next thing I want to talk about, next slide, is where we are with the space oversight. So a lot, again, this is from the DoD perspective. We're sort of waiting for the DoD guys to figure out where they're headed, and then we'll take a look at the IC side. But basically on the House side, they've kind of come up with three things. It's the Space Corps. I think everybody here has heard of the Space Corps. If you bring in the Missileers, you're probably about 30,000 folks. They kind of said it's like the Marine Corps of the Navy, although the Marine Corps, Mike, where were we at? Like 180,000 now? So it's not really a good analogy. But anyway, Space Corps is still in the mix from the House side. They want to make the space, again, another sub-unified command. And then basically what they talk about is they want to terminate that principal DoD space advisor, the PDSA role. Get rid of that altogether. They kind of don't like that at all. Now on the Senate side, I don't know if you guys have seen it, they come up with this new title. It's the Chief Information Warfare Officer. So it would be at the OSD level. John Stimbit, when he read it, sent me a note and said, kind of sounds like the old ASD NII. But again, the House and Senate have various kind of positions in terms of where they would like to go. There are some very, very active voices on the Hill in terms of where that goes. CAPE has been looking at this for the Secretary, and Secretary has a CDA back to the Hill that I think they would like to see what the Secretary's recommendation is in terms of where the department would like to go with space oversight. So I think they would like to take that into their conference session. But if you go to the next slide, one of the things that John Oram is the CAPE analysis that's doing this, one of the things he keeps talking about over and over again as he looks back in history is he said we focus a lot of our energy, like probably 80–90% of our energy on what it is we're buying, what's the capability we're buying, and not a lot of attention and energy on how we actually buy it. So one of his perspectives given to the Secretary was, I think we need to spend energy on both of these. Now, I mean, it's important to help, influence what satellite we're buying or what airplane we're buying, but it's also as important to talk about how we buy that. So again, it's sort of TBD there in terms of where we're going with the space oversight conference. The guys from the Hill are back, and hopefully the department will send in their CDA answer, and we'll start working forward. So, and then next, go ahead, next slide. So again, on your seats, I just wanted to give a shout out to INSA. It's, I think, has everybody read the document sitting around you? Good, excellent, because as I've told the folks that helped author it, when you first read it as a govie, you kind of look at it and go, ugh, it's terrible. And government guys are a little slow, so you read it again, and after a while you go, hey, that's not bad, that's not bad, that's not bad. So there's lots of good nuggets in there as well. Talks about how as a IC we should be thinking about more of the service-based acquisitions that we're doing in terms of not an MSA oversight role, but more of a kind of a D&I oversight function as well as from the contractor's perspective. So, all right, next slide. So I just wanted to give you one perspective from the Air Force. I think this is the Air Force perspective. Is the Air Force guys have a general that works money. They have somebody that works ops, and they have somebody that works the acquisition side. So when you look at the Air Force perspective, there's a lot of people that have influence in terms of making decisions. When they look over at Betty Sapp, the director of the NRO, she's got everything, right? So she's got the NIP. She basically launches satellites, she operates satellites, and she builds satellites. So I think from the Air Force perspective, go ahead, next slide. What they'd like to see is somebody on the Air Force, and again, I might be misquoting where the Air Force position is, but the last I checked in, they would like to have a person like Betty, someone like Betty, that basically has those same kind of authorities, right? Maybe it's like a Space Command and a SMC smushed together, but it's somebody that basically is an equivalent on the Air Force side to the director or NRO, and then basically you report up to an XCOM that would be like a vice chairman, deputy secretary, PDD&I kind of role. So again, and that XCOM up there, I don't know if that's the right title or not, but that's the way the Missile Defense Agency does their stuff. It's called the MDEB. So they don't go through the big DAB, they don't go through the JROC, they have their own little XCOM with those types of members to make decisions. So again, that's sort of, I think, where the Air Force position is in terms of where they'd like to see this space oversight stuff go. Next. So just real quick, I just wanted to run through some of the key focus areas we've been looking at. I got to give a shout out to Dr. Anthony Vinci from NGA. He is pushing hard on this thing, this public-private partnership. So if you haven't seen it, I think it's in the SASC or SISI language. But basically, in a nutshell, NGA forms a corporation that doesn't have to follow all the Title 10, Title 50 rules and regulations. So they can hire people, not like the government hires people. They can sign sole source contracts. They can do competitions. And so this public-private partnership is a kind of a response to the critics on the Hill that keep saying, hey, the acquisition process within DOD and the IC is just too slow. So again, I'd ask you guys to take a look at this new public-private partnership. He's got nice glossy kind of things like the INSA report, but it's really, really, really interesting. Now, some would say, give me an example of some of the public-private partnerships that Congress has authorized. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. So think Amtrak, U.S. Postal Service, but there's others that are much more, I wouldn't say successful, but much more in line of what Dr. Anthony Vinci's pushing. So anyway, take a look at that. It's very, very interesting how NGA is looking at doing sort of a rapid acquisition capability. It's called the public-private partnership. Next is Milestone Delegation. So there are certain, and I'm looking over at the former SAE from NSA. If she had had her druthers when we got together, she would look at me and say, Kevin, I want you to delegate all those milestone decisions to me. I'm speaking for Jennifer right now, but I think the perspective of, and a lot of folks on the Hill will call me and say, what does that mean when you delegate a milestone decision? I would tell you, whether it's Jennifer making a decision or at the AT&L, AD&I level, you still have the same artifacts. You still have the same documents. So you still have an ICE. You still have requirements. And so we all have the same statutory documents to put together to make a program decision. And whether it's Bong and I making that decision, or if it's the SAE making that decision, it's still the same documentation. So again, I think where the AT&L is in the reorg with ANS, and they're looking, the Air Force and Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps are looking at all of those milestones being delegated back to the services, to the SAEs. I think we've been doing that since I got at the DNI. That was one of the first questions Clapper asked to me was, hey, rationalize how many MSAs we have and look at how you do delegation. So Bong and I sat down, and we've gone through all of the different MSAs. So for instance, out of Betty's portfolio of MSAs, we've probably delegated half of those already. So I would tell you where the department is now, I think we've been doing that on the IC side for probably a couple years now. I know if most of you have heard Betty's speeches, she would like to delegate all those MSAs to her. But I think we have a good mix between the two of delegating all and delegating none. So half our portfolio is delegated. I think we've done a nice job of scrubbing that. If anybody saw Sue Gordon's testimony, one of her big pushes that she's looked at us, not only from the S&T side in terms of innovation from the S&T and AI and where we're going with all that stuff. She also turned and looked at me and said, I want innovation in our business processes. So, like for instance, we're doing an analysis of alternative for the EO follow-on constellation. And she looks at me and she goes, why does it take 9 to 12 months? Those kinds of questions. So again, in terms of acquisition reform, acquisition streamlining, whatever it is, I've got a brand new PDD&I that's looking at me saying, all right, let's take a look at all of our business processes and let's rationalize those to say, does it really take that long? I mean, you hear it from Senator Warner all the time. It takes too long to build stuff. So I got some charts for the last two, so let me just go ahead, next slide. I think one of the things that I've been working with the agencies is trying to help form. So I come from DOD. When I grew up at NavAir, I mean, you basically had your Milestone Decision Authority, your SAE, you had your PEO, and you were the PM. And it was a direct line, and you could go see your MDA anytime you wanted to. ASN RDA, door was always open. So I think NRO was the first. Betty actually is dual-headed. The director of NRO is the SAE. They've named all the tower directors as PEOs, and then you have PMs. And the PEOs, you guys all know who the tower directors are. From my perspective, one of the things I think it really helps as you form these organizations is you do a nicer job of recruiting. So you go into the Air Force and you say, hey, Air Force guy, I want you to come over and be my PM. He sees a structure that looks similar to what he's used to in his acquisition training. And, so again, I think it helps. NSA, Jennifer got there as well. So under the NSA B business, the deputy there is the SAE. They've created a PEO structure, and they have PMs as well. So, and again, before Jennifer left, she actually took it to where they have it divided into 3 different categories, from R&D to the services to MILCON. So the PMs there absolutely understand where they fit into the process, and as she goes out, or as she did go out and recruit PMs, they knew where they fit. It's sort of, when I was at NavAir and you jump around from the different, from the EP3 program to the ES3 program, you sort of knew where you fit because you were a PM, there was a PEO. To me, it helps for recruiting and training. So I got to give a shout out to Mike Perrin, who is our new CAE over at DIA. He is now taken up to his director. He's got from 2 to 7 PEOs that he would like to create out of DIA. Depending on where they fall. But again, he has taken that same kind of structure that NSA did. He's looking under, so he is the CAE under CFO, and basically creating PEOs and then PMs. So again, it's process, like that one statement said, but I think it definitely helps recruit and retain our PMs, especially as we drag them out of DOD. All right, next slide. So one of the last things, I don't know if you guys saw that little acronym I had up there, CRITIC. So I'm trying to create a new acronym here. Hopefully it'll stick. This is my last point for you guys. So the holy grail for just about everybody here that's ever done acquisitions is cost realism, right? So I think I've talked to every single one of you in this audience that have said to me, have you seen that award that contractor bought in? Right? There's always that flavor of somebody bought in, somebody lowballed it and bought in. So in terms of cost realism, we went to go talk to the RCO and Randy Walden's guys. They actually took a new kind of model format in terms of risk and applied it to the B-21 program. And so we are actually taking that and we've actually incorporated into one of our section LMs of one of our current competitions. So I just wanted to run through with you, what does it mean when we say cost realism? So typically, everybody here that's done a source selection, you have your technical team, you got your cost team, you go into the SSA. Next slide. You usually have that scorecard. Go ahead. Yep. So there it is. You sit down with your SSA and you said, here's your technical, and so you kind of look and you say, all right, offer number 1. Boy, they got it in the bag. But if they've and you give them a blue because they've underbid the government reference architecture by $100 million. So then the SSA looks at you and you go, how do you know that they're not buying in? Right? That's the question. How do you know that that's a realistic cost that they have put into bid? So next slide, I just wanted to show you. So basically what, some of the terms I hear from contractors is they'll put in a bid, a cost to win. And then we have, from our ICE guys, our cost estimators, what we think the government reference architecture costs. So now in our section L&M, what we're asking for is a risk factor that goes towards that piece above what the bid is. So let's say contractor bids 300 and we think it's going to be $400 million. So what this allows us to do now is go back and forth with the contractor to say, we thought it was going to be this much, you guys bid this much, tell me how you got that much savings between where we are, where we thought we were at and where you're at. And again, in our section L&M, it's actually quantified in terms of 10, 20, 30, 40%. And so the B21 guys came back and gave us great stories where they said, all right, so we're 200 million apart. Where did you get this? First thing it came back with is, hey, we have IRAD money. That's $70 million that we're investing in ourselves. That's where we get 70 of it. Okay, great. That sounds great. Now, where'd you get the other 130? And they go through that with them. So again, I think one of the big holy grails we've been working, everybody in this room's been working, is how do we win contracts but have realistic costs in our bids? So, next slide. Oh, and by the way, what's really, the B21 guys came back and told us was, what was really good about this whole cost realism is it actually brings together the cost team and the technical team. So they're going back and forth as they negotiate with the contractor, which they said has really, really just been phenomenal in terms of driving good behavior. But next slide. So here is this is my last slide, sorry. Critic. So I know everybody here cringes when they hear that LPTA term, right? Low price, technically acceptable. So I'm trying to drive something new that everybody can take away with after seeing my stomach, and throwing up in your mouth. That's what I really want to leave with you guys today. It's critic. So what we're trying to go with is cost, realistic, technically credible. That is where I think, hopefully, you guys will not come back to me and say, boy, that cost realism piece in the section L&M really stunk and it drove bad behavior. Hopefully, you'll start to see that more and more, and we'll get that term into that we are making awards that are cost realistic, technically credible. All right. So I hope that drives some thoughts into your head as the panel comes up. So over to you, Barry.
Thanks, Kevin. And I'm sure they'll write some questions together. So at this point, I just want to introduce Jennifer Wallace-Smith, who's the moderator of our panel. Extremely successful career as a senior acquisition executive at a place not too far from here during a period when they had rapidly changing requirements and time when she did a tremendous job up there. And she'll introduce the rest of her team. Thank you, Jennifer.
We all coming up? Should we all go up, please? So good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good. So day 2 of the forum, I hope we can have a lively discussion this morning with a set of experts that INS has assembled, which is just incredible. I think they're incredible because they bring such a blend of knowledge from both government experience to industry experience. To different types of companies in industry, and that collective discussion, I think, leads to the conversation we'd like to have this morning. So actively, I'm hoping it'll be a conversation and we'll all engage. But before we get started, I just want to kind of set the tone for something. So how many of you watched the news this morning or in the last 24 hours? There you go. Pretty good. Always in the intelligence community, people watch the news. So pretty alarming when you think about it. Watching the news for me, turning it on in the morning or in the evening, pretty alarming what we see happening across the world. Whether it's a recent terrorist attack happening with one of our sister nations, whether it's another launch happening in North Korea, whether it's one of our ships having a little incident in the seas, it's it's a time where there's so much happening in our world. So now let me ask you, do you feel we're in a time of increasing threat in the last 5 years? Show of hands. All right, so fair enough. Now, is our acquisition procurement system keeping up with the pace of that change? Show of hands. Not quite. And yet, incredible people doing incredible jobs every day. It's just that the pace of the threat that's affecting us is just unprecedented. So we've looked at acquisition a lot. Today's discussion with the panel, though, is about action. Not about criticizing that which we haven't done, but focusing on the actions that we can take going forward. So as we introduce each of the panel, their first question that I will ask them is, if you had one item you would recommend as critical to change, to improve delivering our capability, not the process, what would that be? So as I introduce, let me just say my panel members, all the way to the right is Al Munson. He goes without introduction in his experience and knowledge within the community. Former D&I for acquisition, many of us know my mentor as I was trying to make the changes within Fort Meade and making many pieces of advice to me. Long industry person and esteemed systems engineer. To his left is Ellen McCarthy, leader in NGA, key in their plans and policy, and went on to industry and plays a very key role in INZA. To the left, then, from the former NRO and CEO of Buck Consulting, Nick brings another set of IC experience, focusing on how we do strategies and best practices, and we were just talking about source selection experience and how we need more of that across industry and government. And then to my immediate right is Charlie Stein. Charlie from the Maryland Procurement Office, longtime career procurement individual, but also very close with mission, worked in mission organizations, PEO, as Kevin brought up, and so what an incredible set of panelists. So, to get us started, Nick, can you lead us off? If you had one thing that you would recommend, what would that be?
So I'm going to start this with just a FAR reference here. So there's a FAR and then there's a subpart. So I'm going to do my one, but I'm going to have a couple of subparts, right? So I would start with some realities here. DevOps, I'm going to make a statement here. DevOps is eating waterfall. Managed service provider models are emerging in industry around us, and technology cycles are shortening to the point where, as a government program office, it's very difficult to even understand the technology we're about to buy. So let's put that on the table as a reality. Now, where I think the gap comes is what I'll call a self-inflicted set of wounds. And I'm thinking in terms of the execution level. The MSA level and the CAE level are very important, but down at the execution, the contracting level, we make choices not to use the full extent of what the FAR lets us do. And I think, in fact, I spoke with the 809 panel about this very thing. And there's a lot we can do. We're seeing a lot of things like OTAs. Those are process reactions to not using the full playbook we have. So I say that would be one. The second thing is, from a PM standpoint, the tradecraft of program management may not be where it was, say, 7 or 8 years. There's a lot of reasons for that. And so I think that really kind of leads to a self-inflicted gap here in terms of we're not in the habit of speed. And to the point that Kevin brought out in the 809 panel about process over performance, I think that is really what I would focus on. And I would say, if you want recommendations, again, it's a 3-part recommendation. The first one is, I would say we've got to get our heads around the reality of speed. Get into a habit of speed here, because that's a muscle we don't really have. Whether that's how does DevOps flow into our current waterfall transitions into operations. I think there's a dialogue that needs to be had here. The INSA report is an outstanding way of starting that. I co-chair an industry advisory group under USGIF where we're working with NRO. There's an NGA advisory group as well. Anytime, and I would encourage everybody in the audience, get involved in those conversations, because it's part of increasing the dialogue. The second thing is I would offer that COs and PMs and OGC get reacquainted with the extent of market research. I think a lot of people in this room might agree that we're actually causing, and I say we, the royal we, are causing more protests because there's less information flow. So it's maybe a little counterintuitive, but the reality is the more information and understanding, I think we're going to be would be a little bit more protest proof. And then finally, I think the longer term question, this is really a leadership question. I go back to 2000 when we did a complete fleet change out of the imagery and targeting architecture in 36 months. That's speed. And there's a guy named Kevin Miners in ASDC3I at the time who gave us the top cover for that. And I think when we look at the acquisition skills and how contracting officers are making decisions and using the full playbook, that is a leadership thing that needs to be kind of encouraged. So those are kind of three things I would put into my one.
I think that's fantastic. I couldn't agree with you more. Information flow is counterintuitive. But if you sit down and explain the basis of usually a source selection decision, it negates so many different protests. And yet, we find, especially with, I'll call it, less and less experience in the procurement process, the tendency is to have less communication because they feel safer. But in fact, it then, coming all the way back to your point, slows down the whole process. Helen, can you pick that up and then share your thoughts on that relative to collaboration, and then what's your number one recommendation?
So I think my number one actually answers that question, and I'm not going to jump into the FAR and talk about specific parts of it. I'm going to raise it up a little bit because I think at the end of the day it's about people, and it's we call it tradecraft, but. As I reflect on my career in government, I realized that I spent the first 15 years and had no idea what acquisition was. And it was somebody on the other side of the building that took care of it. And they took care of it, or sometimes they didn't take care of it, and I never really questioned it. And so I've had to catch up a lot over the last 5, to understand what is it. And I think acquisition is as much an art as a science, except we like to focus on the science part of it, when at the end of the day, a lot of it is just common sense. And so, you talk about speed, and virtually every speaker here yesterday and this morning has said we're not fast enough, you're not supporting our needs. And I think that's because there's this absence of common sense. And so again, as I reflect on my career, 15 years, I didn't know what acquisition was. And I got promoted to senior executive. I actually went back and read what is the definition of a senior executive. And I had no business being promoted to senior executive. Because while I was a great sub-analyst, I didn't do half the things. I didn't know half the things that was expected of me. And yet I can't believe I'm alone in that regard. And so we then move people into positions of authority, and we wonder, why are things not getting done? Why are we not taking action? There's 500 reports on acquisition. Why aren't we doing anything about it? It's because we just don't know how. And that's a whole other discussion altogether. Now, Mary Quinn is leading a working group with INSA on our acquisition council. She's doing a fantastic job about identifying some ways that we can fix this. I'll tell you, Kevin, as you're looking at your organization, I think I would recommend moving your acquisition workforce into the mission side of the house and making them a part of the team. Because I think that's where you're going to get some common sense. So, and while you're working on the process, let's just give people an understanding of what is needed, when it's needed, and how to do it. So, I'll stop with that.
That's just fantastic. So let's see, Charlie. You want to add to that?
Sure.
What are your thoughts?
I think that I benefited from growing up in an agency where mission, acquisition, and our private sector partners were always extraordinarily tightly coupled. When I started out in contracting, I was always embedded with my mission clients, and we were always very close to our private sector partners. I think that that has helped in understanding how business gets done from my perspective, understanding what our private sector partners are dealing with, and then being able to keep those lines of communication open among mission, acquisition, and the private sector. And Jennifer, you did a lot of things as SAE when you were there to keep that really tight, and we continue to build on that. I think the one thing that I would like for us to be able to do at NSA is really get a lot better about writing down what it is we want to get done, And then when we're talking to our private sector partners about providing us either with a product or a service or a capability, measuring their ability to do. We spend a lot of time talking about ability to staff. We do a lot of work analyzing FTEs. We spend a lot of time on the input side of the equation without the real metrics on the output side of the equation in terms of, so what did we actually get for all of those inputs? And if we can think more about what a company's ability to do is and assess their ability to do, and then award contracts based on that technical capability to actually get something done rather than simply staff it up, I think we'd be in a much better place.
I think that's fascinating because that's actually the UK model. They form strategic relationships, and it's based on who they think can do the job and over a much longer tenure. So that's a very interesting approach to things. Al, what are your thoughts on all of this?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Some of you may have seen the article that I published now almost 2 years ago in the Potomac Institute journal called "Why Can't We Get Acquisitions Right?" And the fundamental point that I made in that article was that we have kind of lost our ability to get, at least on cost-plus procurements, credible proposed cost and schedule baselines. I have quoted in the paper and in speaking a former prominent CEO who is widely reported to have lectured one of his losing proposal teams that there's no excuse for losing a cost-plus competition on cost. And it turns out that industry has taken that to heart, and the government has done its own part in all of that by actually accepting bids that were based more on desperation. Our colleague Scott Large used to refer to these as death bids. They are either bids where the existence of the organization is at stake, or whether it is such an attractive opportunity for a new business entry that kind of the cost realism goes out the window. As I said in my paper, this process of let me call it an overly optimistic bid, when it's accepted, then leads inexorably to what I have paraphrased a famous book from our past as The Journey Through the Valley of the Shadow of Death, where it's almost impossible. Some programs survive that journey, some do not. They are all damaged in the process, and the overall reputation of the acquisition community suffers, to say nothing of the needs of the warfighters and the policymakers to get the systems that they need. So the single thing, Kevin, darn it, you stole my thunder. Critic, if
Actually,
we
maybe
can.
he was listening.
I'm sorry.
Maybe he read your paper.
Well, I'm sure he did, because we have discussed it many times. So whether you can make that acronym stick or not, the whole idea of focusing on cost realism and technical competence is the watchword, I think, for better acquisition performance. I need to do a shout out for my colleague Betty Sapp at the NRO, who last February published a policy paper admonishing her acquisition community to go after executable program baselines in terms of cost and schedule. And so I think a commitment to getting to executable cost and schedule baselines on awarded contracts is the key thing.
Very, very important. Hey, I'm going to give a shout out. We are collecting questions at this time, so fill out some index cards. If we don't get index cards, then I'm just going to start asking questions of various individuals. So that's incentivizing you to send forward some cards. I want to change to a theme that I think resonates right in the flow of what we're talking about, and that is, how do we attract and retain talent? And I don't mean just in the government. I mean in the industrial base as well. When I look around at all of us, we need to build the next generation. the generation that's going to want the speed but needs the knowledge before we all go on to our next endeavors. And so I'm going to ask Ellen, how do we build and retain that talent? Do you have thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts on this one. You know, it's funny, in my time at INSA, where we had developed an intern program, almost never did you hear a college or a graduate student say, when I graduate, I want to go work for Jennifer Wall-Smith at NSA on acquisition. You know, they all wanted to be spies. They all, but nobody said, and it wasn't because of you, nobody said. I think there was one intern in the last 10 years that has said, I want to work acquisition. And I think the problem is that we have made acquisition, it gets to my opening point, we've made it this sort of scary thing that's done someplace else and it's not connected to reality. And yet the reality is that, you know, we've heard everybody over the last 2 days say, Kurt Dukes yesterday said, our acquisition workforce is not keeping up with the needs of cyber. And so, you know, and again, why would you want to go join a workforce where you're going to get bashed for not doing what it is you're supposed to do? And so I think this demystifying acquisition and making it something, making it is cool. It's mission critical. It is an absolute. If we can't do our job without an informed, educated acquisition workforce. And so that's why, Kevin, I suggested, what mechanisms do you have at the DNI to encourage the agencies to bring, you know, that workforce into the mission side of the house? One of our recommendations in our paper was to recommend or to suggest, or to the extent that the DNI has the authority, that the agency heads get regular updates on major acquisition programs, just as they do on movements, you know, operational developments across the IC at all levels, that make this a part of their job. As a senior executive, you're expected to do this. It's part of your job description. Yeah. So I think that's one way that you'll encourage people to start thinking about acquisition. It is cool. It is fun. It is mission critical. The other thing is that it gets to the professional development of the people that you already have in the workforce, and to the extent, and that is on the public and private side. So, you know, if you are a fantastic South Korean sub-analyst who has a desire to move into the management track, just as they do in the military, expose them to people, dollars, and requirements. You know, it doesn't mean they have to go to Defense Acquisition University, but to the extent that they're given exposure, they're given responsibility, that they engage with that side of the workforce. I think that needs to be a requirement for development of our seniors. The other thing is to maybe change the way we recruit people and to look in different places. Having spent some time in the professional development side of the house, we still, for the most part, recruit people the way we've always recruited people. And so I think maybe coming up with some creative ways to go to universities and places that we've never been before to bring those folks in. So just a few suggestions.
Nick?
So I'd like to amplify that a little bit. Really in two parts. One, and as a commercial consulting practice, we have the privilege of working with a lot of different industry partners, as well as working with the government. And one of the things that we see is, let's just call it what it is. We have maybe some competition for developer resources between the commercial, private sector and the public sector. Okay. So the real question is, how do I get somebody who's coming out of school that's a really wicked coder and get them interested in government service and working for one of the industry partners or for the government directly? And I think if you look at those, that generation of kids coming up behind us, and I'm thinking of my own son right now, they don't know the difference. They don't understand a thing called waterfall. They don't understand ORRs, TRRs, all those different milestones we have to go through. And again, I'm not at the MSA level here. I'm really at the execution level. They understand I do daily sprints. I do daily work. I do daily promotes. And so if we don't figure that out, it's going to be really difficult. We might get them, but it's going to be hard to keep them. So that's one thing, I think. So it's really a change in our operating model that between government and industry, we've got to really kind of figure that out. The reality is we have a lot of systems. We were talking before the panel about we have a lot of legacy systems that were not built in agile DevOps, and so they're brittle, and we've got to be very careful about that. So one of the conversations we might want to have as a public-private partnership is how do we handle that? How do we handle DevOps and waterfall together bimodally for the short term until we fly out the legacy systems? That would be one question. On the tradecraft side with the PMs, there's a martial arts term called shu-ha-ri. And I think in my own career as a PM, the shoe means you do exactly what you're supposed to do. I taught you how to do this. Don't vary. You don't have enough experience to do that. So that's the shoe part. Raw is ha is the part where we say, okay, I know enough. Now I can use alternative ways to do this. They're all still valid ways, but I've got more experience. And then the re part is when I'm actually saying, okay, I'm going to pilot something new. And again, all still within the FAR and the regulations, but it's a lot more complicated. And so if I don't have the experience to do a kind of acquisition, and I try explaining that to my CEO, they're going to look at me like I got three heads. So it's a really, I think, a career planning kind of point to Ellen's point. That if I can look at a PM and I look at those milestones and I say, okay, are you ready to go to that next level? And I think, frankly, to be a little bit provocative, I think a lot of people are stuck in the shoe phase.
So I think in terms of training and professional development for the junior workforce, I spend a lot of time with the kids who are the new hires at NSA. And one of the ways that we can keep them at least in the acquisition business, is to expose them to the mission side. It might sound counterintuitive, right? If we expose them to the mission side, they'll go to the mission side. But that exposure to the mission side makes them understand how their contracting, how their acquisition work is really contributing to the development or the delivery of a thing. And if they can go out and see the thing while it's being built, or if they can spend some time in an operations center at midnight watching an operation go down, they can really understand all what they did that contributed to the ability of either the analysts or the operators to actually get that thing done. And again, I just think about my own career. I benefited from having been in places where I was taken into the mission. I sat with them, I learned with them, I went out to field sites, I went out to contractor facilities, and part of it is we've got to break the dependence on the technology and the email for communications. And I tell the youngins, I say, look, why don't you just call somebody on the phone rather than dropping a counteroffer to their proposal via email? Or why don't you just get up from your desk and go see them, go visit them, and get that interaction. That way, the acquisition professionals begin to understand the business side. I've spent some time in Paul's facility, so I know what Paul does over there, right? And I've got a better understanding. And I've spent some time on an ops floor, or I've spent some time out at a collection site, and I know what those things are that I'm buying. And then I'm more excited about doing the ditch digging that I have to do in order to get that thing delivered, right? So the training, professional development, those of us who've been around for a couple thousand years really do need to grab onto some of the folks that are coming up and bring those opportunities to them.
That's great. I'm going to change topics for just a moment, and then I'm going to turn to the set of index cards. How, though, this is right in line with one card that I have, is how do we promote and educate on outcomes-based procurements? Very much one that we all are striving to move to. How do we attack and move the needle relative to outcome-based contracting?
If I can start my answer in the former topic by reflecting on my long service with you on your acquisition panel, one of the handicaps that organizations with heavy mission focus have is that acquisition tends not to compete well in organizations like that, compete well with mission, for example. Others have kind of made allusions there. And that's a problem because while the actual number, I think, is at least sensitive, something over 60% of the NIP budget gets spent through acquisitions. And so, apropos Ellen's comment that for the first 15 years of her career, she had no idea how 60% of the money in the community was being spent. It is a high leverage affair. So what we need is we need professionals who, in acquisition, to make sure that the monies are spent effectively in the acquisition programs. And if you're not experienced in the acquisition process, you tend to fall back on the prescriptive elements of acquisition. What is taught at the DAU, what the contracting officer or the OGC may tell you about what the rules are. If you're going to get to outcome-based acquisitions, it means that you have to be willing to look beyond just the narrow rules of what is in the FAR, what's in the DOD 5000 or the ICD 801s, all of those processes, and be able to identify with mission and be able to inculcate the requirements of mission into the process, not just the rules of procurement. And to do that, acquisition people need to serve longer tours so that they've got the time to get the mission understanding and to develop the confidence in what they're doing that will allow them to make the selective pushbacks against the narrow prescriptive rules in acquisition and go for mission benefit.
If I can follow on to that.
Go right on.
So for a long time, DoD has actually provided that statement of objectives be used as opposed to statements of work. And that's been a policy for a long time, and yet it's not widely implemented. And I'm not exactly sure why. I think it gets back to, your comfort zone is to go with the process you've got, or to always go back to what's prescriptive vice what makes sense. Because it's in policy now that you can use that, and when it has been used, it's been with great success. I mean, I think it gets back to, I'm going to go back to the people part. If you don't know what you want, if you don't know the outcome you're looking for, if you don't know the objective, if you've thrown the question over to somebody who's been in their job for 2 years, you're not going to get outcomes, and you're not even getting. I mean, if you can't define the objective, you're not going to get it, right? So. I think that's the problem, and it gets back to the people. It gets back to how do you explain to your workforce, whether they're on the mission side or the acquisition side, what it is you want. And by the way, I think risk is a part of this as well. So Senator Warner this morning talked about the IC being risk averse. So the other problem is if you lay out an objective, you might get it wrong. And you know what, you don't want to get it wrong, so let's just be safe. You might have to identify what the risks are. We need to incorporate risk into our culture as we're sitting here identifying what it is we want. I'll leave it at that.
For sure. So I'm going to dovetail onto some of these questions into what should we do actively in the next 90 days to improve collaboration both in industry and from the government. So that was the question. Any panel member who would like to jump in? Next 90 days.
So I'm gonna dovetail on something that Mr. Stein mentioned in terms of identifying what the government wants to have procure. There's a discussion going on right now about how do you actually deliver on in an agile way, and what's the right contracting approach for that. I think that in the next 90 days, there's already some conversations going on with industry partners on how do I measure speed, how do I measure deliverable. And of course, the government's not going to contract, although I think NGA may have done a pilot contract on story points for Agile. At the end of the day, what we need is working software delivered. But there are a lot of ways to measure that, and there are probably some contract language changes that need to be implemented to actually do that. So I would suggest that one of the things that we can do from the government industry standpoint is get together and talk about what some of those are, and some specific changes that would be very pragmatic. Because at the end of the day, it's kind of hard to hold somebody accountable on the government side when they actually don't have the answer. I mean, if this is relatively new, it's kind of hard to tell somebody why they're screwed up if they're not. And industry hasn't really been exactly organized around coming up with the answers either. So I think that would be a really good collaboration.
Anyone else? Al?
One of the other drums that I have whaled on, some would think interminably, is on the question of protests. And for those who have close enough former colleagues or current colleagues in the government and who have a chance to talk to them, you've probably gotten a feel for how much of what they do which leads then to kind of objectionable delays and objectionable characteristics of procurements, are motivated by their fear of avoiding protest. We talked a little earlier about the question of having open dialogue periods going further so that the communication is better. A lot of the reluctance of procurement organizations to conduct this more open dialogue longer into the procurement cycle goes back to protests. So apropos your request for something specific, I'd like to suggest that the procurement organizations, perhaps starting in the IC Kevin and perhaps over in AT&F, convene a working group, a joint industry government working group aimed at exploring what really is underlying the whole question of protests and what kind of joint process improvements or agreements could be made that would essentially try to drive the whole protest process down as an element of the way we're doing business with one another.
So I'm going to turn to Charlie and ask a question. I'm dated now, just coming up on a year in industry on protest numbers. But I've heard over and over again that we believe protests are on the rise. So I know Charlie is within the Maryland Procurement Office at NSA. I'd like to hear from him as to, do we think protests are on the rise, and what can we do to mitigate those?
So I know from our perspective at NSA, they are. We're sitting on 3 of them right now.
Really?
And it used to be you could go a decade without one, never mind 3 in the same year. I'm really not sure what is behind all of that. So we've taken a look at the reasons why we get these protests and how we dispose of them. I think part of it has to do with the fact that we do have a junior workforce at the agency, and they're not necessarily crossing all of the T's or dotting all of the I's, so somebody's going to grab that punctuation mark and run a protest in on it. I can say that we've not lost yet. We don't intend to, but I think we're getting ourselves at my agency into a cycle where we've got a number of our attorneys are tied up dealing with the protests, and they don't have the cycle time to help get the procurement packages in non-protestable shape. So they're spending some time dealing with this protest, and something goes out the door that probably shouldn't have gone out the door because they didn't have that one turn they wanted to do on it to make sure that was fixed.
Or they slow it down.
Or they slow it down. And I love our attorneys. I always have. It's easier, I think, these days to protest than it used to be. It doesn't cost as much to put one together. And we've seen a lot that have come in that don't seem to have a whole lot of merit, and we treat them all exactly the same. So, but that's cycle time, right? You know, maybe a contracting officer is going to learn an awful lot about contracting by dealing with a protest. That's not the lessons we want to be teaching our COs, but they are up in our industry.
And I think the thing coming back to talent, and people, I'm sure most of you know, but just to reiterate, is protests are on a timeline within the government, and so they take priority. Everything else sits in the back seat, and obviously making sure they do due diligence is then affecting anything else that was scheduled to go out the door because we just don't have the number of people. And so the fact that they're on the rise is very, very concerning.
Knock it off.
Let's see. I'm going to ask a few more questions here just about why don't we refocus our acquisition education on the flexibility and innovation allowed in the FAR? Our focus on the FAR limitations creates a longer, like a no-go approach.
I'll just give you an example. When I was at PMA 281 at NavAir, it was right after 9/11, and we had we put priced options on contracts, and we would be able to execute those with a letter once the money arrived. So we knew that we didn't have the full money. We had a bunch of unfunded requirements. And lo and behold, 16:30 on a Friday, the fax machine would light up and we get $2.5 million, and that would be obligated on Monday. I came back to the NRO and I said, hey, let's go ahead and put some priced options on here for our unfunded requirements. No, we can't do that. Well, why can't we do that? Because we don't put anything on a contract unless it's funded. I said, but then it wouldn't be a priced option. True story. So I think what I would say is this is actually, I think, comes back to a leadership moment. I don't want to be melodramatic, but I think the entire process is a little bit fear-based. Fear of protest, fear of mistake, fear of looking bad, frankly. And I think this is where leadership really can play a critical role in terms of, hey, this is the way you can do this. We can do a priced option in this case. But we've got to be able to give our COs and PMs a little bit of that permission, if you will. And one of the ways we do that is we start them off on small programs when they're junior, where they can have a certain amount of money that's not going to get us all in too much trouble if it doesn't go as well as as we want. So I think if we start kind of fostering that at an earlier age, obviously this is not an overnight fix.
Did you want to add to that?
Well, I think it gets, okay, so I'm on a theme here, it's the people part of it, but it really gets to how you reward people, how people, carry out their day, and it really gets to reward. So to your point, Nick, if you're going to get slapped for doing something wrong, why aren't we saying, look, you did this quickly, let's give you it's a leadership issue, and I think it comes from the top down, which is, I'm going to go back to the recommendation that I would recommend to the agency directors, and I know they've got a lot on their plate right now, but to the extent that they are engaged in the acquisition process, and because it's as important to an agency director as it is to somebody who's expecting the intelligence support, and bringing those folks into the fold, and again, rewarding. I think, we have some great success stories, so why aren't we highlighting those success stories, and why aren't we modeling off of them, and why aren't we promoting those people into positions where they can affect change?
Let's see, I'm going to change to a very specific question that came, and that is, what is the strategy for modernizing acquisition and contract writing systems as well as the business systems? Now, I know Charlie has spent a lot of time on that, but I will then turn to anyone else who wants to jump in.
Well, so we're buying a contracting writing system. Right now, the one that we had was a homegrown system that was, it was great for what it was supposed to do, but there were a lot of things that you couldn't do with it. So we went out and we acquired a commercial product, and then we went and made a bunch of modifications to it. So the product that we're using is a little less commercial than you would have thought it would be. And we've learned in the last, year or so, that some of the things that we did, some of the modifications that we drove into it, we're now taking out of them because they, in practice, didn't make a whole lot of sense. So we swallowed hard, and we made some of those decisions, and we're actually driving more technology into contract writing. But it's not easy. We still carry files around. We still carry folders around, and we still insist on wet signatures, even though, we do the digital signature thing for everything else. So it's mind-blowing.
We can sign our keys that communicate our most critical communications, but we have to have wet signatures on our contracts. And I'm with Charlie on this, not a criticism. I just know how hard it is to make those changes, and how astounding. So let's see. We've talked a lot about the talent that is still gaining experience within the government. This question is about how can industry help the government while they're working on their long-term growth of their experienced procurement and program management teams. Is there something industry could or should be doing? That's a hard one.
Well, I think you guys do it, at least for my agency. You invite us out to see what it is you're doing, and you allow us to get the opportunity to spend some time with you, with the technology, with the capabilities, and with all of the different products and services that you offer. So I would just say, keep that door open. Eventually, somebody's going to walk through it and say, hey, that's a great thing, I want to buy it.
I'll reflect back on a paper that INSA wrote a few years ago actually, I don't think it was a paper, but it was a follow-up study on the impact of OCI on the intelligence community. And Jennifer, I actually think you were a part of all this when you were at NSA.
Yes, I
Because
was.
I remember sitting down talking to you about this specifically. But what we suggested in that paper, and I think it still applies today, is putting together some sort of an industry group that actually provides some real analysis of what the impact of acquisition policies or changes is having on the private sector's ability to support government. I know this was very OCI specific, but I think it can be much broader. So if you could get an industry group, an AFCEA, an INSA, or somebody who in coordination with the IC or DOD says, we're going to look over the course of a year and give you back feedback, very specific, measurable feedback on how the things you're doing are affecting your ability to get the mission done. And I thought that was a great idea then. I still think it's a great idea today because I suspect there's a few people in this room that would be very happy to give their time to that effort. And it would be a real resource that the government could then use to assess how it's doing.
That's a great idea. I'm going to give my own recommendation to industry relative to giving experience back to the junior government workforce. I know it's hard for them, but invite them out to see the incredible things that all of you built. They are all inspired if they can get away from their desks. And so I know you probably have to knock 10 times to get them to come, but don't stop knocking. Because I think it gives them that perspective on that which they're working on, and they need that. And so that's my recommendation to my industry colleagues. Keep knocking.
I would add on to that and say that, especially if we're talking about recruiting and retaining talent, is start doing these IRAD projects that everybody I'm sure is doing, but look at with an eye towards how is this going to change the way we operate in our trade craft in the community. So then knock on that door and come. And I would say, so the other part of this equation though is for the government. I'd almost say make it part of a junior officer or junior acquisition person's job. Maybe it's an annual objective they have to do to make that time. The biggest challenge that I find now, looking from the other side of the fence back into my old digs, is that nobody's got time. And so when you don't have time, you don't make time. So it might be, question here might be make the mechanism to make the time, and then from the industry standpoint, don't be discouraged. Get back in there and let's make it. And I don't know, maybe there's a structure that we can put behind that.
I think it's a great.
And I would say invite the lawyers to come with them because I think that's the biggest issue. I mean, the reality is that in my time now in the private sector, I've invited numerous folks from agencies to come and visit. And there are some, and I won't call them out, that are better at it than others. And the ones that are not so good at it, it's almost always because there's the perception if I go and see what you've got, then I've got to go see what everybody else is doing as well. And so it's a no, it's a hard no. And that's not satisfactory. So.
Yeah, for sure. Al, did you want to add something there?
Well, I'm going to stray over into the moral lecture zone here for just a second. I know this is probably don't smoke, and don't drink too much. I spent my career in industry taking my company into business areas where they did not have a position and building a position. And I will tell you that sometimes that is really ugly. That, I made reference to the journey through the valley of the shadow of death. When you do that, it can be really ugly. And what happens then is that if you're not prepared to deliver on the contractual commitments that you've made, you jeopardize the policymakers' ability to get to what they need done. You may jeopardize warfighters. If your government counterparts are skilled enough on their side, they may keep it from going too far. But if you get in over your head, there is hell to pay. In cost-plus contracting, either fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of that gets forgiven in the interest of keeping an industrial base together. But I would encourage you to be good citizens and patriots when you think about entering new businesses, and try to find a way when you want to make that entry where you can learn as you go without doing too much damage, and get your folks to the experience levels they need to be at before you are really on the hook to deliver mission and national security critical end items.
All right, we are down to our last 2 or 3 minutes, and I'm saving the best question for last. So I'm going to ask you to indulge me in that. The question comes to the cost realistic, technically credible. Do we think it is going to be successful, and how would we go about implementing that? I'm going to throw that back to the forum. To a show of hands, are we going to support the head of acquisition for the DNI in implementing, are you ready? Say it with me. Cost realistic, technically credible. Critic. Show of hands.
Sure, sounds good.
I want to thank all of you for setting forth so many set of questions. I know I didn't get to all of them, but and then I want to thank the panel members for the active engagement. We have a lot of work to do. As we turn on the news and we see tonight, I'm sure there are more events happening in the world while we sit here and participate in today's forum. So acquisition and procurement is incredibly important, and we know we've got to pick up the speed. I want to thank INZA for putting this panel together, and Kevin for joining us this morning in the keynote. Give a round of applause to the panel.